Today on State Scoop's Priorities podcast, brought to you by Scoop News Group, ways to speed up delivery of BEAD funding. Welcome to State Scoop's Priorities podcast. Every Wednesday, you'll get insights into the state and local government community. You'll hear from top leaders and learn about the latest news and trends ahead for the industry. I'm your host, Jake Williams. Here's what's happening this week. Amid delays by the federal government to release public health data like counts on avian influenza cases, state governments are continuing to bolster their own public health reporting tools. Many states have launched or expanded their public health data portals in recent years. Among them is the state of New York, where State Health Commissioner Dr. James McDonald says it's, quote, critical that health professionals have access to timely, high-quality data. The National Association of Secretaries of State are calling on U.S. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem to retain certain services used by state and local officials to protect the nation's critical elections infrastructure. The request arrives as Noem evaluates further cuts to her department, and specifically to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Voting is now open for the 2025 edition of the State Scoop 50 Awards. The State Scoop 50 Awards annually recognize the top people and projects across the state government technology community for their contributions to improving government services and experience. Voting is open until March 14th at statescoop.com/statescoop50. You can find these stories and more at statescoop.com and in links in today's show notes. The Advanced Communications Law and Policy Institute at New York Law School has a new report about how to speed up delivery of funds from the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. The $42.5 billion program administered by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration is designed to increase connectivity nationwide. The report encourages the Trump administration to roll back unnecessary requirements, provide clearer guidance on using those funds for satellite internet services, and more. Michael Santorelli is the director of the Institute. He tells State Scoop's Keely Quinlan about the recommendations and what it means for broadband expansion.
So I run a program at New York Law School called the Advanced Communications Law and Policy Institute. It's an academic program through which we do a lot of studying of all things broadband. And certainly over the last few years, BEAD has been, dominated the conversation around all things BEAD, or all things broadband, trying to finally close the digital divide, which has been around for, 3 decades now. And so we've been tracking BEAD very closely since it was announced and has been rolling out, and have been closely looking at every aspect of it, from the initial NOFO through challenge processes, through initial plans, through the whole gamut. And so once the election was over and we saw the outcome and we saw that there was going to be a change in administration, we thought it would be a good time to put together some recommendations for the new folks coming in to address what, in our view, we saw as some not so great things that came out of the last administration, in an effort to try to speed things up a little bit and get money flowing.
So it sounds like, and based off of my reading of the report, is that bureaucracy really was and continues to be a challenge. So what are the stipulations included in BEAD that you all found to be problematic? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the BEAD statute itself is part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of a couple of years ago. And the BEAD statute itself is very complex, and it has it's very specific, which is rare for Congress to do. And so it said to the NTIA, you have to do this, dozens of steps to get things rolling out. And so on its own, it was a very complex project to roll out, lots of boxes to check that Congress gave to NTIA. But as things went along, the previous administration under President Biden went very slowly in a lot of ways. It was a complex statute to administer, but at the same time, one could argue, and we argue, that they could have gone a little bit quicker. And part of the delays in implementing the program were the addition of lots of what we say extra statutory, extraneous things that weren't in the statute itself, but that were kind of layered into the BEAD program from the very beginning. And in our report, we point out that in addition to, again, being very specific about states have to do initial proposals and 5-year plans and all these things, The Biden folks at NTIA also included any number of additional planning elements that had to go into their initial proposals around uh, labor rules and requirements, climate resilience planning, environmental reviews, things like that we go into a little bit more detail in the paper that really have no basis in the statute, and those were just kind of, again, the additions that were put on to states, along with, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit later, are things around regulating the prices of the offerings that were going to be provided over these networks, middle class affordability plans, which were not mentioned in the statute. So a whole host of things that were kind of added on and lengthened the planning process, lengthened the review process, lengthened the approval process. And so, here we are 3+ years later, and no BEAD funded networks have been built yet.
So the report includes 7 recommendations for the Trump administration to take up and considering some changes to the program. Can you talk to me about some of those, and if you could, like, point to which ones maybe states should know more about?
Sure. So the top one, the very first one, is kind of builds on what I was just talking about around trying to roll back as many of the additional requirements that were put on there by the Biden folks, and to try to get the BEAD program overall more closely aligned with the text of the BEAD law. And again, that law is very complex, and it has lots of steps and requirements on its own. And but trying to pare back the additional things that were put in there by the Biden NTIA, which, I mean, it all impacts states, certainly, because states are administering the program and they have had to comply with all the requirements and guidance documents and things issued by NTIA. So to the extent that those requirements could be rolled back, things might be a little bit more simple for states to administer. And just a couple of examples of that. Another major recommendation in our paper is to address this notion of rate regulation, which there's been debate over the last few years as to whether the Biden NTIA had engaged in some form of rate regulation with its rules. I mean, we have argued that it has. The BEAD statute itself prohibits NTIA from regulating the prices, but we've argued that NTIA had previously essentially coerced states into adopting its low-cost option framework, which required states to set a specific price point for this low-cost option, which would be available to low-income households and others that qualified. And to us, that was a form of rate regulation. Anytime you saw to try to control the price or set the price of broadband, that is essentially rate regulation. And that's something that we think should be rolled back completely, and letting applicants kind of set their own price and then argue why that is affordable in their view. And another issue for states that we tee up in our, I won't go through each one, but another one that we tee up in our paper would provide states with more flexibility to adjust the size of the project areas where these BEAD funds go. And this is a little bit more technical in nature, but in general, the states have set the parameters of the areas in their states where BEAD-funded projects would go. And some have set them at a very large scale, like county-wide, and some have set them very small. There's been some consensus among ISPs and others that would bid on these dollars that smaller project areas are better because bidding on having to serve a county, for example, doesn't really align with the realities of network deployment and existing networks. So things like that, these kind of very nuts and bolts types of things, of paring back requirements from NTIA and then providing some clearer guidance to states as to what they can and cannot do on certain things around like project areas, and maybe adding additional requirements that go above and beyond what the NTIA has set, would be very helpful, I think, to kind of streamline the entire process.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's such helpful context to, kind of think about all of this. And I know one of the other recommendations that you all included was providing clearer guidance about the role of satellite services, like Starlink, for example, in terms of how to use that, how to use BEAD funding to pay for that. Um, the governor of Louisiana, Jeff Landry, recently sent a letter to the Commerce Department asking for similar provisions as well. So I'd love to hear from you, like what specific guidelines should be issued regarding, LEO satellites, and how should states be advised on balancing fiber and satellite and, other types of internet service provisions.
Yeah, so this is the big issue. It's been a big issue for a while as to one, if fiber should be the priority service, and then two, the role that every other kind of platform should play, including LEO satellite. In our view, and the way we read the BEAD law, is that it makes sense that fiber is the priority technology, and we've already seen it. I mean, in the 3 states that have already awarded grants, Nevada, Louisiana, and Delaware, they've all been able to award the vast majority of their funds to fiber deployment. And I think there's a lot of appetite out there and desire by governors across pretty much every state to try to get as much money to fiber, because it is a more cost-effective, scalable technology, and it makes sense in a lot of contexts. But there's a point at where it becomes way too expensive to deploy, when you get to those really, really hard to serve remote areas or geographically challenging ones. And then there you start thinking about alternative technologies. And those there are primarily fixed wireless and satellite. And what we've talked about in our paper is, and this gets down into the weeds a little bit, but there's this thing called the extremely high cost per location threshold, which kind of sets that bar, that cutoff point, after which it becomes too expensive for fiber. And then after that point, you can start looking at other technologies and platforms. So that threshold has been set by states because the cost to deploy varies from state to state for the most part. And the cost to deploy in really remote Nevada is different than the cost to deploy in what's considered remote Delaware, for example. And so what we've recommended was that NTIA provide a little bit more guidance as to what that threshold might be, because again, so far states have been able to set it themselves, but we recommended that NTIA maybe put some parameters around it. And we reference a study that's been done by Cartesian, which is a pretty objective third-party firm that's been doing a lot of mapping and modeling throughout BEAD and following it pretty closely. And they've come up with a number of around like $9,000 or $10,000 per location as kind of like that threshold figure. And then if cost per household to build a network goes above that, then you can start thinking about these alternative technologies. And then so that, I think, would give states a lot more clarity around the role that satellite and fixed wireless might play. We argue in our paper that between what's called like unlicensed fixed wireless and satellite is probably the better option, just because it's a little bit more consistent, it seems, performance-wise. But there's still questions out there as to whether it could, how much capacity it has and how much service territory it can cover. There are some that want to give all the money or a lot of money to LEO and just call it a day. And just, that's, seems, some people think that's like the best solution just because you do it quicker and cheaper. But again, there are still those questions out there around capacity and whether it really is as reliable as terrestrial networks. So, in our view, as we argue, fiber should continue to be the priority focus for the vast majority of BEAD funding, but being a little bit more realistic about the costs and having NTIA weigh in a little bit more clearly as to when it's appropriate and to rely on these other services. And I should also mention too that under the Biden administration, they had carved out a much smaller role for unlicensed fixed wireless and satellite, but they would still were labeled unreliable broadband platforms, and so that doesn't really make a lot of sense if you're going to let them serve households and still call them unreliable. So I think just having NTIA, the new NTIA, going back and taking a closer look at how they're describing these alternative platforms and the parameters around which that they can be used in certain instances.
I am going to play devil's advocate here for a second. What would you say to someone who maybe is like listening to this, or is also considering the ways in which satellite can be expanded under the BEAD program, and maybe pointed to concerns about spending money, government money, on Starlink, specifically as it relates to Elon Musk, who owns the company that owns Starlink, now serving in a department capacity lead for the federal government with the Department of Government Efficiency. What would you say to somebody who was like, whoa, hold on, let's take a second?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly it's a good point. It's a good consideration. I mean, without getting too far into the politics, I mean, yeah, it seems like there are potentially conflicts there. But I mean, for what I understand about what Elon Musk is doing through Doge, he hasn't really done much, if anything, around with NTIA or the Commerce Department or FCC or any of those types of areas. So for now, he seems kind of walled off from it. But I think at the same time, it has proven itself to be a pretty robust and reliable platform in its kind of niche markets in the United States and elsewhere around the globe. And Starlink isn't the only one. I mean, Amazon has been pretty aggressive with its Kuiper, I think it's called, product. And I've seen its name pop up in a bunch of states as having pre-qualified for BEAD. And so they'll probably be very aggressive in bidding along with Starlink. But I think, so long as the kind of ethical side, the conflict of interest side doesn't stays the way it is, I guess. From all appearances, it seems like it is pretty walled off at this point between what Elon Musk is doing and Starlink. I think it makes sense to rely on them, but I think the subtext of some proposals that we've seen has been that some people think or want a lot of the funding to go specifically to Starlink. I don't think that makes sense, just given all the other, the small role that I think makes sense for it to play. I don't think it makes sense for Starlink. And I don't think a lot of people, including governors of states that have been focused on this for a while, think that Starlink will play a huge role. I think that it'll play an important, smaller supporting role, but I don't think there's consensus that it'll play, the main role. I think most people think fiber will continue to serve as the primary platform.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, thanks for taking some time to kind of walk through that with me. So my last question for you. So say the NTIA takes up these recommended changes. What metrics will you and the ACLP be using to kind of gauge the effectiveness of the program? Will it be like a faster rollout? What are you going to be looking for specifically to measure success?
Well, it'd be great if they took up some of the recommendations. We hope they will when everyone's kind of, through confirmation and seated in their new jobs. But the primary metric is speed at this point. getting things done, money out the door. I think shovels in the ground. I think that's the primary metric that a lot of people are looking at and have been frustrated with the previous administration for having taken so long to get to where we are now. And I think we're at a good point. All the states have their plans ready, and the kind of the grant infrastructure is in place in most states, and a lot of states are already accepting applications. But anything that could be done to speed up the process of not so much awarding grants, but getting those finalized and shovels in the ground. And so a lot of the recommendations that we have were, again, pulling back requirements and rules and things that were added on by the previous administration. And, a lot of those can come off through kind of on the back end of awarding grants and the negotiation and terms and agreements of grants, and anything that could be simple, make that process simpler and easier, and people signing documents, and again, just getting money out the door. So I think that's the primary metric here is how fast shovels can get in the ground. Because previously, had Biden been reelected and the NTIA regime had stayed the same, they were on a timeline for not getting shovels in the ground in some states until like later next year, or potentially. And so anything that can close that or shorten that period of time and start getting projects going soon in the spring, certainly, hopefully, I think would be easy to claim a success then.
Michael Santorelli, Director of the Advanced Communications Law and Policy Institute at New York Law School. You can read more about him and broadband deployment at statescoop.com and in links in today's show notes. You can subscribe to the Priorities Podcast at prioritiespodcast.com and wherever you get your podcasts. While you're there, be sure to leave a review or a rating on the podcast page. That small extra step helps more people like you find the show. This podcast is a production of Scoop News Group in Washington, D.C. The State Scoop editorial team provides our news coverage and interviews. That team is Colin Wood, Keely Quinlan, and Sophia Fox-Soel. Adam Butler and Carlin Fisher help produce the show, and the entire Scoop News Group team makes it happen. Until next week, I'm Jake Williams. Thanks for listening.